Before the sun set that day, a man chose silence over fear, and a town learned what truth sounds like when no one can outrun it. The wind moved slow across Caleb Thornfield's ranch, dragging thin lines of dust over dry earth that hadn't seen rain in near 3 months, the wooden fence creaking soft like it remembered better days, and out past the corral, where the land dipped just enough to hide a body until you were close. Something shifted against the light. Caleb noticed it without moving his head, just the slight narrowing of his eyes beneath the brim of his hat. The kind of stillness a man learns after years of living alone where trouble doesn't knock. It arrives quiet. She stumbled the last few steps and caught herself on the fence post, fingers gripping rough wood like it was the only thing keeping her upright, her dress torn by travel not violence, her breath shallow, uneven, and when Caleb finally turned toward her, there was no surprise in his face, only recognition of a pattern he'd seen before, not the woman, but the moment. He walked the 20 feet between them without hurry, boots pressing into dust that didn't hold prints for long, and when he stopped, he didn't ask who she was or where she came from, because the answer to those questions never changed anything out here. Her eyes lifted to meet his, dark and steady despite the exhaustion, and for a second she said nothing, like she was measuring him the way a person measures a bridge before stepping on it. Then her voice came, low, almost breaking, "My father, my brother. They did it." And the words didn't echo, they settled. Heavy, like something placed between them that couldn't be taken back. Caleb didn't flinch, didn't lean closer, didn't even blink right away. He just stood there, letting the wind carry the meaning through him instead of around him. And when she looked down at her hands, he followed, saw the stains there, darkened by dust and time, not fresh, not hers, and something in his jaw tightened just enough to notice if you were looking for it. 3 hours later the sun had started its slow drop behind the western ridge, stretching shadows long across the ranch, and the silence that usually settled in at that hour didn't come alone this time. It brought hooves, distant at first, then growing, then too many to ignore, and Caleb stood on his porch with one hand resting against the post, watching the horizon where shapes began to form out of dust, riders, not hurried but not hesitant either, the kind of approach that carried assumption, not doubt. Behind him, inside the small cabin, the girl sat at the edge of a chair she hadn't fully trusted yet, her back straight despite the weariness, her eyes fixed on the doorway like she already knew what was coming and had accepted it long before she reached this place. The riders came to a stop just beyond the gate. 6 men, then 8, then more filtering in behind them until it wasn't a group anymore. It was a statement, hats pulled low, hands resting near belts not in threat but in habit, and the man at the front, broad shoulders, gray at the temples, swung down from his horse with the slow confidence of someone who expected to be obeyed. "Thornfield," he called, voice carrying easy across the distance. "We're looking for someone." And Caleb didn't answer right away. He just stepped down from the porch, boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud, closing part of the space between them without invitation. "You got a girl pass through here?" Another voice added, sharper, less patient, and Caleb's gaze moved across the faces, counting, reading, not their words, but what sat behind them. The certainty, the kind that didn't come from evidence, but from needing something to be true. Inside, the chair legs scraped lightly against the floor as the girl stood, her fingers brushing the edge of the table where a small piece of silver lay, broken, dull under the fading light, something she hadn't let out of her sight since she arrived. Outside, Caleb finally spoke, voice low, even, maybe, and the word didn't offer them anything, didn't deny, didn't confirm, just existed, and that unsettled them more than a refusal would have. The gray-haired man took a step closer to the gate, eyes narrowing slightly. "She's wanted," he said. "People say she brought trouble with her." And the others shifted behind him, not restless, just waiting for direction, for permission to turn suspicion into action. Caleb glanced once over his shoulder toward the cabin, not long enough to give anything away, then back to the man. And for a moment it looked like he might say no, like he might close the distance and stand in their way. But instead, he reached up, adjusted his hat, and said something none of them expected, something that made the air itself seem to pause. "Then you'd better come get her." And behind him in the doorway, the girl didn't move, didn't speak. She just watched him, trying to understand the man who had listened to her truth and was now handing her over to it. The gate creaked as Caleb Thornfield pushed it open with one steady hand, the sound cutting through the quiet like a line drawn in dust that could not be erased, and the men outside shifted in their saddles, not out of fear, but out of expectation, because this was the moment things usually turned simple, the moment a man chose a side. And from the doorway behind him the girl stepped forward into the fading light, her movements slow but certain, like someone who had already walked this path in. Her mind long before her feet followed, and she did not look at the men, not at first, her eyes fixed on Caleb as if searching for something he had not yet given, not reassurance, not protection, something else, something harder to name, and Caleb did not return the look. He only stepped aside just enough to leave the path open, not wide, not welcoming, just enough. The gray-haired man at the front took that as permission and walked in without asking, boots crunching against gravel that had not seen this many strangers in years, his gaze sweeping past Caleb to the girl, measuring, weighing, deciding before a single word was spoken. "You have been a long way from where you belong," he said, his voice calm in a way that carried judgment more than anger, and the others followed behind him, filling the yard with a presence that pressed against the wooden walls of the cabin like a storm that had not yet chosen whether to break. The girl stood still, shoulders squared though the wind tugged lightly at the loose strands of her dark hair, and when she spoke, her voice did not rise, did not plead, it simply carried, "I am exactly where I chose to be," and the words settled differently than expected, not defiant, not weak, just true, and that truth made a few of the men glance at each other without understanding why. Caleb moved then, not toward them but past them, closing the gate behind the last rider with a quiet finality that did not go unnoticed, and when the latch fell into place, it sounded heavier than it should have, as if something more than wood and iron had just been set. "We will take her from here," one of the younger men said, stepping forward with the kind of confidence that had not yet learned caution, but Caleb's voice came before the movement finished, low, steady. "You will not take anything from here," and that stopped them, not because he raised his voice, but because he did not need to. The gray-haired man turned slightly, eyes narrowing. "You just said we should come get her," and Caleb nodded once, slow. "I said you should come," he replied, and there was a difference in those words that took a moment too long for the others to catch. But when they did, it shifted something in the air, subtle but real, like the first drop of rain on dry ground. Inside the cabin, the small table stood where it had before, and on it lay the broken piece of silver, dull but unmistakable in shape. And the girl stepped past Caleb without being told, walked to the table, and picked it up with careful fingers, holding it not like a weapon, not like evidence, but like something that carried weight far beyond what it was made of. And when she turned back toward the men, she held it out in her palm, not offering, not accusing, simply showing. The gray-haired man's gaze flickered to it for a brief second, just long enough to reveal recognition before he masked it again, but Caleb saw it. And so did the girl, and that was enough. "That belongs to someone who cannot speak for themselves anymore," she said, her voice still even, still controlled, and one of the men shifted his weight, looking toward the leader for direction, because this was no longer as simple as they had expected. "You are making a mistake," the leader said, his tone tightening just slightly. "Whatever story you think you have, it will not change what people already believe." And Caleb let that hang in the air for a moment before he stepped forward again, placing himself not between them and the girl, but beside her, shoulder to shoulder, not as a shield, but as something steadier, something harder to move. "Belief is not the same as truth," Caleb said quietly, and the words did not challenge, they did not argue. They simply existed, and that made them harder to ignore. The wind picked up then, carrying dust across the yard, brushing against boots and coats and the rough wood of the fence, and in that brief moment of movement, something shifted inside the group, not outwardly, not enough to change what they had come to do, but enough to plant doubt where certainty had stood, and doubt, out here, was a dangerous thing. The gray-haired man looked at the silver piece again, longer this time, and when he spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier ease. "Where did you get that?" he asked, and the girl did not hesitate. "From the place your son thought no one would ever look," she answered. And that was the first crack, small, almost invisible, but real, and Caleb saw it widen just enough to know what came next would not be decided by force, not by numbers, but by something far quieter, something that had been set in motion the moment a girl chose to speak and a man chose not to look away. The question hung in the air longer than it should have, stretching the silence until even the wind seemed to hesitate, and the girl did not lower her hand, the broken silver catching what little light remained as if it refused to be ignored, while Caleb stood beside her without shifting, without adding a single word, because he understood something the others did not yet see, that once truth is placed in the open, it does not need help. It only needs time. The gray-haired man took one slow step forward, not aggressive, not retreating, just closer, his eyes fixed on the small piece in her palm as though distance alone could change what it meant, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost the weight of command and carried something quieter, something uncertain. "You should be careful with accusations you cannot prove," and the words were measured, but there was a fracture beneath them that could not be hidden. The girl's fingers closed gently around the silver before she spoke, not to protect it, but to hold it steady. "It is not an accusation," she said, her tone calm. "It is a memory." And that word settled differently, deeper, because memories do not ask permission to exist, they remain whether believed or not. One of the younger men shifted again, glancing between the leader and the object, his confidence thinning at the edges. "We came here for her," he muttered, more to the others than to anyone in particular, as if reminding himself of the purpose that had felt certain just moments ago, but now seemed less defined. Caleb finally moved, a single step forward that brought him slightly ahead of the girl, not blocking her, not hiding her, but changing the line between them and the others in a way that was deliberate, his boots pressing into the dust with quiet certainty. "Then take her," he said, and the words landed like a stone dropped into still water, unexpected, heavy, sending ripples through every man standing there. The younger one blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly, and even the gray-haired man paused, his eyes narrowing again, searching Caleb's face for something that would explain it, but finding nothing but the same stillness that had been there from the beginning. "You would hand her over after all this," the leader said slowly, and Caleb gave the slightest nod. "If that is what you believe is right," he replied, and there was no challenge in his voice, no resistance, just a statement that placed the weight of choice back where it belonged. The men did not move, not immediately, because something in that exchange had shifted the ground beneath them, turning certainty into responsibility. And responsibility was harder to carry than anger. The girl stepped forward then, closing the space Caleb had left, and she did not look at him this time. She looked directly at the gray-haired man, her gaze steady, unflinching. "If you take me," she said, "you will take this with you." And she opened her hand again, revealing the silver piece once more, and for the first time, the man's composure broke just enough for those watching to notice, a flicker in his eyes, a tightening at the corner of his mouth, a recognition that could not be undone. "That proves nothing," one of the men said quickly, too quickly, and the girl turned her head slightly toward him, not with anger, but with a quiet certainty that made the words fall flat. "It proves where you have not looked," she answered, and then she returned her gaze to the leader, "and who you chose not to question." And that was the moment the silence changed, no longer empty, but filled with something heavier, something that pressed against each man's thoughts whether he wanted it to or not. Caleb exhaled slowly, almost inaudible, and rested his hand lightly against the fence post beside him, not out of fatigue, but as if grounding himself in the only thing that did not shift with opinion or belief. And he spoke again, softer now. "You came here certain," he said, "but certainty is not the same as being right." And the words did not accuse, did not demand. They simply offered a truth that could not be forced. The gray-haired man looked from Caleb to the girl, then back to the silver, and for a long moment, he said nothing, his jaw working slightly as if weighing something that had grown heavier with each passing second, and behind him, the others waited, not for an order this time, but for an answer they could accept without losing the ground beneath their own feet. The wind moved through the yard again, lifting dust in soft spirals that drifted between them, blurring edges, softening lines, and in that quiet, uncertain space, the man finally spoke, his voice lower than before, stripped of command. "Where?" he asked, not loudly, not forcefully, just one word. But it carried more weight than anything he had said since arriving, and the girl did not hesitate. She stepped past Caleb, past the line that had divided them, and pointed not toward the hills, not toward some distant place, but back toward the road they had come from, toward the town itself. And that was when the silence broke, not with sound, but with understanding, because sometimes the truth does not lead you away from danger, it leads you straight back to where you refuse to see it. No one moved at first, not because they could not, but because they no longer knew which direction meant forward, and the girl's hand remained raised, pointing back toward the road that cut through the dry land like a scar, leading straight to the town they had all come from, the place they trusted, the place they believed they understood, and now, the place that felt just uncertain enough to make every man there hesitate. The gray-haired man followed her gesture slowly, his eyes tracing the invisible line from the ranch gate to the distant outline of buildings barely visible through the dust. And for a moment, the authority he had carried so easily seemed to shift into something heavier, something that required thought instead of assumption. "You are saying this began there," he said, not as a challenge, but as a question he had not expected to ask, and the girl lowered her hand just enough to meet his gaze again. "I am saying it never left," she replied, her voice steady, her words simple in a way that made them harder to dismiss. Behind him, one of the men let out a quiet breath, the kind that comes when certainty slips just enough to reveal doubt underneath, and another adjusted his stance, no longer leaning forward but not stepping back either, caught in a space between action and reconsideration. Caleb watched it all without interruption, his presence unchanged, but his eyes sharper now, measuring not the men themselves, but the shift happening inside them, the slow turning of something that had been set long before they rode out to his land. "If what you say is true," the gray-haired man continued, his voice lower now, less certain, "then you should have brought this to the law." And the words sounded thinner than before, like they had lost some of their weight on the way out, and the girl's expression did not change, but something in her posture did, a slight straightening, a quiet resolve that made her answer carry further than the distance between them. "The law was the first place I went," she said, and the silence that followed that sentence was different from the others, not empty, not waiting, but heavy with the implication that something had already failed. Caleb shifted his weight then, just enough for the boards of the porch behind him to creak softly, grounding the moment in something real, something present, and he spoke again, not louder, but clearer. "You rode out here with a conclusion already decided," he said, his gaze moving from one man to the next. "Now you have a choice to make with what you did not know before." And the words did not accuse them of being wrong. They reminded them that they could still decide what came next. The younger man who had spoken earlier glanced back toward the road again, then at the leader, uncertainty written plain across his face now. "We could go back," he said quietly, as if testing the idea more than suggesting it. And the gray-haired man did not answer immediately, his eyes still on the girl, still on the small piece of silver that seemed to hold more weight than any weapon ever could. "If we return," the leader said finally, his voice careful, deliberate, "and this leads nowhere, then you will answer for wasting our time." And the girl gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in understanding. "If it leads somewhere," she replied, "then you will answer for something else." And that was the closest she came to a challenge, not loud, not sharp, just a statement that placed the burden exactly where it belonged. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, carrying a thin veil of dust across the yard that blurred the edges of everything for a moment. And when it passed, the scene remained the same, but the feeling had changed. Something unseen had shifted into place, something that could not be undone by simply turning away. The gray-haired man turned back toward his horse slowly, each step measured, as if he were reconsidering not just what to do, but how. He had arrived at this moment in the first place, and when he reached the saddle, he paused, his hand resting on the worn leather, and looked once more at Caleb. "You are choosing to involve yourself in this," he said, not as a question, but as an observation, and Caleb met his gaze without hesitation. "I am choosing not to ignore it," he answered, And there was a difference there that did not need explanation. The leader nodded once, a small motion, almost reluctant, then pulled himself into the saddle with the ease of long habit. And one by one, the others followed, not with the same certainty they had arrived with, but not with hesitation either. Something in between, something that would carry them back to a place they now saw differently. As the first horse turned toward the road, the girl stepped back slightly, the silver still in her hand, her eyes following their movement not with fear, but with a quiet steadiness that had not been there before, and Caleb remained where he was, watching until the last rider cleared the gate, until the dust settled again into the familiar stillness of his land. For a long moment after they left, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching out between them like the open plain. And then Caleb finally turned his head just enough to look at her, not asking, not questioning, simply acknowledging the path that had just been set in motion, and she met his gaze once more, the same way she had when she first arrived. But this time there was something different behind her eyes, not just truth, but the certainty that it would no longer stay hidden where it had been buried. The dust had barely settled when the sound of hooves faded into distance, leaving behind a silence that felt different from the one before, heavier, like the land itself was waiting to see what would come next, and Caleb remained by the gate a few seconds longer than necessary, his hand resting lightly on the wood as if measuring the weight of what had just passed through it. While behind him the girl stood still, the silver piece now closed in her palm, not hidden, not displayed, simply held. The sun dropped lower, stretching shadows long across the yard until they touched the porch, the fence, the empty space where the men had stood, and Caleb finally turned back toward the cabin, his boots slow, deliberate, each step carrying the same quiet certainty that had defined every choice he had made so far. She followed without being asked, not close, not distant, keeping the same space between them that had existed since the moment she arrived, a distance built not from fear, but from respect for something neither of them had yet named. Inside, the cabin held the same stillness it always had, the rough table, the worn chair, the faint smell of dust and old wood warmed by the day's heat. And Caleb moved to the small shelf near the wall, pouring water into a tin cup before setting it down within her reach, a simple gesture, unchanged, as if the world outside had not just shifted. She took it, her fingers steady now, and drank slowly, her eyes not leaving him, not searching, not questioning, just watching, as though trying to understand the man who had walked a line between surrender and defiance without crossing fully into either. "They will go back," she said after a moment, her voice quiet but certain, and Caleb nodded once, leaning slightly against the edge of the table. "They will," he replied, and there was no doubt in it, because he knew men like that, knew how long it took for doubt to turn into action, and how quickly action could turn into something else entirely. The light shifted again, dimmer now, the edges of the room softening as the sun slipped further behind the ridge, and for a while neither of them spoke, the silence stretching not from discomfort, but from the understanding that words would not change what had already begun. Outside, a single crow called from somewhere beyond the fence, the sound carrying across the empty land like a reminder that not everything waits for men to decide its course, and Caleb pushed himself upright, moving toward the door again, his gaze drifting toward the horizon where the road disappeared into distance. "You believe they will listen," he said, not turning, not asking, simply placing the thought between them, and she stepped closer to the doorway, stopping just short of crossing the threshold. "I believe they will hear," she answered, and there was a difference in that, one that did not promise outcome, only possibility. Caleb let out a slow breath, almost a quiet acknowledgement, and reached for his coat, the worn fabric carrying the marks of years spent under sun and wind, pulling it over his shoulders as if preparing for something that had not yet arrived, but was already on its way. "Then we do not wait," he said, and this time there was direction in his voice, not urgency, but decision, the kind that does not look back once it has been made. She watched him for a moment longer, then nodded, a small movement, but one that carried the weight of agreement, and when she opened her hand again, the silver caught the last light of the day, glinting briefly before fading back into dullness, as if reminding them both that what it represented would not shine on its own. It would have to be brought into the open, Caleb stepped off the porch, moving toward the corral where his horse stood, calm, steady, the kind of animal that did not startle easily, and he saddled it without hurry. Each motion practiced, efficient, as if this moment had been waiting for him long before it arrived. The girl followed, stopping a few feet away, her eyes on the road once more. The same road she had come from, the same one they would now return to, but this time with something different riding with them. Not fear, not accusation, something quieter, something harder to turn away from. The sky deepened into shades of amber and blue, the first hint of night settling over the land, and when Caleb finished, he turned toward her, offering a hand not as command, not as rescue, but as invitation, and she took it without hesitation, mounting behind him with the same quiet certainty she had carried since the beginning. For a moment they sat there, still, the horse shifting slightly beneath them, the air cooling as the last light faded, and then Caleb nudged the reins, guiding them toward the gate, toward the road, toward the place where belief and truth were about to meet, and neither of them spoke. Because out here, the most important things were not said, they were carried. The road stretched ahead in a long pale ribbon under the fading sky, the kind of road that looked the same no matter which direction you rode. But Caleb Thornfield knew better, because some roads did not change in dust or distance. They changed in what a man carried with him. And tonight, what rode behind him was heavier than anything the horse had ever borne. The rhythm of hooves settled into a steady pattern, slow enough to think, fast enough to keep doubt from settling too deep, and the girl sat straight behind him, one hand resting lightly against the back of the saddle. The other closed around the piece of silver that had already begun to shift the shape of things. Neither of them spoke for the first mile, maybe two, because there are moments when words only get in the way of what a person already understands, and the wind carried the smell of dry grass and distant water, faint, almost forgotten, like something the land itself was trying to remember. When we reached the edge of town, Caleb said finally, his voice low, steady against the sound of the horse's stride, "You do not speak first." And he did not turn when he said it, did not check if she agreed. Because this was not a command meant to control, it was a boundary meant to protect. She answered after a moment, her voice just as quiet. "You believe they will listen to you before they listen to me." And Caleb let the words settle, not denying them, not confirming them, just accepting the truth inside them. "I believe they will listen to what they recognize," he said. And that was the closest he came to explaining how men like those in that town made decisions. The sky deepened as they rode, the last light fading into a soft blue that blurred the edges of the land. And ahead, the faint glow of lanterns began to mark where the town stood, small against the open land but heavy with everything it believed about itself. The girl's grip tightened slightly against the saddle, not from fear, but from awareness, and Caleb felt it through the leather and wood, a subtle shift that told him more than any words could have. "You have been back there before," he said, not asking, just placing the observation where it belonged, and she nodded behind him, though he did not need to see it. "I went there because I thought they would help," she said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet acknowledgement of something that had not turned out the way it should have. Caleb guided the horse slightly to the left where the ground rose just enough to give them a clearer view of the town below. The buildings gathered close together, the main street running straight through like a line drawn by someone who believed order could be forced onto anything, and a few figures moved in the distance, their shapes softened by the growing dark, unaware of what was riding toward them. "What did they say when you showed them that?" Caleb asked, his eyes fixed ahead, and the girl opened her hand again, letting the silver catch the faint light from the town, dull but present. "They said it could belong to anyone," she replied, and there was a pause before she added, "They said it was not enough," and that pause carried the weight of everything that had followed. Caleb nodded once, slow, the motion almost lost in the rhythm of the ride. "It is never enough," he said quietly, "not until the right man sees it." And the words were not meant to comfort, only to prepare. They rode the last stretch in silence again, the distance closing with each steady step until the sounds of the town began to rise around them. Voices, the creak of wood, the faint clink of metal, ordinary sounds that felt different now, sharper, as if each one carried a question it had not been asked before. as they reached the edge of the main road. Caleb slowed the horse, letting it come to a stop just beyond the first line of buildings, where shadow still held them for a moment longer, and he finally turned his head slightly, enough to acknowledge her presence without fully breaking the forward line of his gaze. "Once we ride in, there is no turning back," he said, and it was not a warning. It was a fact. She shifted behind him, straightening just a little more, the kind of movement that does not show fear but recognizes it. And when she spoke, her voice did not waver. "There was no turning back when I left," she said, and Caleb accepted that without response, because some truths do not need to be answered. He nudged the horse forward again, and they moved out of the shadow into the lantern light, the glow catching on the dust around them, turning it into something almost visible, something that marked their arrival without a word being spoken, and a few heads turned, then more, the quiet attention of a town that had not yet decided what it was seeing. Caleb did not slow, did not look left or right. He rode straight down the center of the road, the girl behind him, the silver still in her hand, and the weight of what they carried settled over the town like a storm that had not yet broken. Because sometimes the loudest moment is not when the truth is spoken, it is when it finally arrives where it cannot be ignored. The horse slowed as they reached the center of town, not because Caleb pulled the reins, but because the silence ahead forced it to, the kind of silence that gathers when people stop what they are doing and start watching instead. And one by one, doors creaked open, boots stepped onto wooden porches, and lantern lights spilled into the street, catching dust in the air like something suspended between moments. Caleb Thornfield did not look at them, not at first, his eyes fixed straight ahead as if the road itself mattered more than the eyes lining it. But he could feel the weight of their attention settle, heavy and familiar, the same kind of weight that had followed men into places where truth was not welcome. Behind him, the girl sat still, her back straight, her hand steady, the small piece of silver now visible in the glow of lanterns, reflecting just enough light to draw the eye without demanding it. And that was all it needed. "That is him," a voice whispered from somewhere to the left, low but not quiet enough to be missed, and another answered, "And that is her." And the tone carried something sharper than curiosity, something shaped by what they thought they already knew. Caleb brought the horse to a stop near the middle of the street, where the light from 3 lanterns crossed and pooled together, the brightest place in town at that hour, and he swung down from the saddle in one smooth motion, boots landing firm against packed dirt that had been walked by generations who believed they understood it. He did not help her down, not because he would not, but because he knew she did not need it, and she dismounted on her own, stepping into the same light, the silver still in her hand, now clear enough for anyone looking to see it for what it was, not just metal, but something carried with intention. A few of the men who had come to the ranch earlier stood near the far side of the street, their horses tied, their expressions no longer certain, and the gray-haired man stepped forward from the group, his gaze moving from Caleb to the girl, then to the object in her hand, and back again, as if trying to reconcile the pieces into something that made sense. "You brought her back," he said, and the words were not accusation, not approval, just a statement that acknowledged the shift that had already begun, and Caleb nodded once, slow. "I brought her to where she was already meant to be," he replied, and that answer did not settle the tension, it deepened it. More people gathered now, drawn by the quiet center that had formed in the street, and among them stood a man near the doorway of a general store, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed too long on the silver in the girl's hand before quickly looking away, and Caleb saw it. The way he saw everything that mattered, not in what people said, but in what they tried not to show. The girl stepped forward then, just one pace, enough to stand fully in the light, and she raised her hand slightly, not high, not dramatic, just enough to let the object be seen clearly, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the street without strain. "You said this was not enough," she said, and though she did not look at any one person, the words found their way to those who needed to hear them. "You said it could belong to anyone," and a murmur moved through the crowd, soft, uncertain, like wind through dry grass. Caleb did not interrupt, did not add to her words. He simply stood beside her, his presence steady, unshaken, a point of stillness in a place that had begun to shift. The gray-haired man glanced back at the others, then forward again, his voice lower now. "We have not heard all of it," he said, and there was a request in that, one he had not expected to make when he first rode out that afternoon. The girl lowered her hand slightly, her fingers still wrapped around the silver, and she turned her head just enough to look toward the man by the store, the one who had looked away too quickly, and she did not point, did not accuse. She simply held her gaze there long enough for others to follow it, and one by one, heads turned, eyes narrowing as they began to notice what had been there all along, but had never been questioned. Caleb shifted his weight just slightly, enough to draw attention back to the center, and he spoke for the first time since they entered the town, his voice calm, measured. "You wanted to see something that proved a story," he said, looking not at the crowd as a whole, but at the individuals within it. "Now you are seeing something that asks you to question one." And the difference between those two things settled into the space between them. Quiet but undeniable. The man by the store did not move at first, but the longer the silence held, the more it pressed against him, until even those who had not noticed him before began to feel the shift, the way attention gathers around something that does not fit the shape it should. And Caleb did not look at him again. He did not need to, because sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is give the truth enough room to stand on its own. The lantern light flickered as a breeze passed through, casting shadows that moved across. Faces now turned inward instead of outward, and in that shifting light, the town began to see itself not as it believed it was, but as it had been acting, and the difference between those two things was where everything was about to change. No one spoke when the silence settled again, not because there was nothing left to say, but because something had already begun to say itself. And the man near the general store felt it before anyone else did. The way attention gathers not in noise but in stillness. The way eyes turn without being told. And he shifted once. Just a small movement of his shoulders, as if trying to shake off something that had already taken hold. Caleb Thornfield did not look at him directly. Not yet, because forcing a man into the light too soon only makes him run. And this was not a moment for running. This was a moment for standing still long enough to see what had been hidden in plain sight. The girl's hand remained steady, the silver catching the lantern glow again, and she took one more step forward, not toward the man, but toward the center, where everyone could see her without choosing to look. "You said it could belong to anyone," she repeated, her voice calm, unchanged. "So ask him if it does." And this time, she did not need to point, because the space around that man had already begun to widen, the kind of space people leave when they feel something they cannot name. A murmur moved through the crowd, not loud, not unified, but enough to shift the balance of the moment, and the gray-haired leader turned slowly, his eyes settling on the man by the store, studying him not as an ally now, but as a possibility. "Do you recognize it?" he asked, and the question carried weight not because of how it was said, but because of when it was asked. The man hesitated, just long enough for everyone to notice, his gaze flickering to the silver, then away, then back again, like someone trying to decide whether seeing something meant admitting it. "It looks like any other piece," he replied, and his voice was steady, but the steadiness came too quickly, like something practiced instead of natural. Caleb shifted his stance slightly, boots pressing deeper into the dirt, grounding himself as he spoke again. "Then step closer," he said. Not loud, not forceful, just enough to make the suggestion impossible to ignore, and the man did not move right away, which told everyone more than if he had refused outright. The crowd waited, and waiting has a way of making truth heavier, harder to carry, and finally, with a small exhale that sounded almost like resignation, the man stepped forward, each step measured, slower than it needed to be, until he stood just within the edge of the lantern light. Close enough now that the silver in the girl's hand reflected clearly in his eyes. "Take it," the girl said, extending her hand just enough to close the distance, not pushing it toward him, not offering it like a gift, simply allowing him the choice to accept what it was. And for a moment, he did not, his hands remaining at his sides, as if touching it would confirm something he had not yet decided to face. Caleb watched without interruption, his presence steady beside her, and when the man finally reached out, his fingers brushed the metal lightly before closing around it, and the movement was small, almost careful, like someone picking up something fragile instead of something ordinary. The crowd leaned in without moving, every eye fixed on the exchange, and the gray-haired leader stepped closer as well, his gaze shifting between the man's face and the object in his hand, searching for something that could not be hidden once it appeared. The man turned the silver slowly, his thumb tracing the edge, and for a brief second, his expression changed, not dramatically, not enough to name, but enough for those watching to see that. Recognition had found him whether he welcomed it or not. "It is just a broken piece," he said after a moment. But the words came softer this time, thinner, like they had lost their certainty somewhere between his thoughts and his voice. And the girl did not respond immediately. She simply watched him, her eyes steady, patient, allowing the silence to do what words could not. Caleb finally spoke again, his voice low, even. "Then you would not mind telling us where the rest of it is?" And that was not an accusation, not a demand. It was a question that had already begun to answer itself. The man's hand tightened slightly around the silver, a small movement, but one that spoke louder than anything he had said, and the gray-haired leader saw it, his posture shifting just enough to show that he understood what had been revealed without being declared. "Answer him," the leader said quietly, and there was no authority in it this time, only expectation. The man looked up then, his gaze moving across the faces in front of him, the same faces that had once stood with him in certainty, and now stood waiting, not for him to defend himself, but for him to speak something true. And for a moment, it seemed like he might, like the weight of what he held might finally settle into words. But instead, he looked back at the silver, turning it once more in his hand, as if hoping it might change if he looked at it long enough. The wind moved through the street again, carrying dust between them, and Caleb did not move, did not press, because he knew something the others were only beginning to understand, that truth does not break a man all at once. It reveals him piece by piece, and right now, that process had already begun, and there was no turning it back. The man's hand did not release the silver, even after the question settled into the air, and that alone told more truth than any words he could have chosen, because a man who holds on to something too tightly is rarely protecting the object itself. He is protecting what it means. Caleb Thornfield watched the small tension in the man's fingers, the way his thumb pressed along the edge of the broken piece as if trying to smooth what could not be fixed, and he did not speak again, because the moment had reached a point where silence was no longer empty. It was pressing, shaping, forcing something to the surface whether it was welcomed or not. The gray-haired leader stepped closer, his boots slow against the dirt, and now when he looked at the man, it was not as someone he had ridden beside earlier that day, it was as someone he no longer understood. "You were asked a simple question," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Where is the rest of it?" And the words did not carry anger. They carried expectation, the kind that comes when doubt has already begun to replace certainty. The man's jaw tightened slightly, his gaze still fixed on the silver, and when he finally spoke, his voice came slower than before, as if each word had to pass through something heavier inside him. "I have seen pieces like this before," he said, and the answer did not meet the question, it moved around it, and everyone there could feel the difference. A murmur passed through the crowd again, softer. This time, not confusion, but recognition, because people know when they are being led away from something instead of toward it. The girl did not interrupt, did not press. She simply took a half step forward, close enough now that the light fell fully across her face, her expression steady, her eyes clear. "You have seen it," she said, not accusing, not raising her voice, just placing the truth where it could not be avoided. And the man's gaze flickered up to meet hers for the first time since he had taken the silver, and in that brief moment, something passed between them, something unspoken but understood, because truth does not always need to be explained between two people who already know it. Caleb shifted slightly, drawing the attention back to the space between all of them, and his voice came low, measured. "You do not need to tell us everything," he said. "Just tell us where it belongs." And that was not a demand. It was a narrowing, a way of reducing the weight of the answer to something that could be carried. The man exhaled slowly, a sound that seemed to leave more than just breath behind, and his shoulders dropped, just enough to show that whatever he had been holding was beginning to loosen. Not fully, not yet, but enough. "It was part of a chain," he said finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of the certainty it had worn before. a necklace, and the words settled into the space between them, small but significant, and the girl nodded once, her hand lowering slightly, not in surrender, but in confirmation. The gray-haired leader glanced at Caleb, then back at the man, and there was something different. In his eyes now, not suspicion alone, but something closer to realization. "Whose necklace?" he asked, and the question did not need to be raised. It carried itself. The man hesitated again, but this time the pause was shorter, as if the act of speaking had already begun to break whatever barrier remained. "It belonged to a woman," he said, and his voice faltered just enough on the last word to make it clear that he knew exactly which woman he meant, even if he did not say her name. The girl's gaze did not leave him, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something deeper now, not just truth, but memory. "She was not from this town," she said, "but she came here because she believed it was safe." And the words did not accuse the place itself, they revealed it. The crowd shifted again, not outwardly, but inwardly, the kind of movement that happens when people begin to see their own reflection in something they had tried to keep separate. And Caleb let the silence hold just long enough before he added, "And she did not leave with it broken." And that was the closest he came to drawing a line between what was known and what was being uncovered. The man's grip on the silver loosened then, just slightly, his fingers no longer pressing as hard, and he looked down at it again, not as something to deny, but as something he could no longer pretend did not belong to a story he was part of. "No," he said quietly, and that single word carried more weight than anything he had said before, because it did not deflect, it did not redirect, it simply acknowledged. The gray-haired leader took another step forward, close enough now that the distance between them had all but disappeared, and his voice came steady, firm. "Then you will tell us how it came to be broken." And this time, there was no hesitation in the expectation, no room left for uncertainty to hide behind. The man closed his eyes for a brief moment, not long, just enough to gather something inside himself, and when he opened them again, they no longer avoided the faces around him. They met them, one by one, and that was when everyone there understood that whatever came next would not be forced out of him, it would be given, because the truth had already found its way to the surface, and there was no place left for it to go but into the open. The man did not look away this time, not from the silver in his hand, not from the faces around him, and not from the weight of what he had already begun to admit, because once a man steps into truth, even halfway, turning back does not make the path disappear, it only makes it harder to walk. Caleb Thornfield stood still beside the girl, his presence unchanged, but his attention sharpened, watching not just the man, but the way the entire town leaned inward now, drawn by something deeper than curiosity, something closer to reckoning. The gray-haired leader waited without speaking again, and that patience carried more force than any demand could have, because it gave the man no place to hide except inside his own silence, and that silence had already begun to break. The man swallowed once, his grip loosening around the silver until it rested in his palm instead of being held, and when he spoke, his voice came quieter than before, stripped of the firmness it had tried to carry earlier. "She came through town 3 nights ago," he said, and the words settled into the space like something long delayed finally arriving. A murmur moved through the crowd, low and uneven, because people remember what they chose not to notice, and now those memories began to return, not clearly, not fully, but enough to form shapes that could no longer be ignored. "She asked for water," the man continued, his eyes drifting briefly toward the ground before lifting again. "Said she had come a long way." And the girl's expression did not change, but her shoulders straightened slightly, as if the truth being spoken aloud gave it a weight that could be carried instead of endured. Caleb did not interrupt, did not guide the words. He simply let them come, because forcing truth out of a man often twists it, and what mattered now was that it came straight. "She wore the necklace then," the man said, glancing down at the broken piece in his hand. It was not broken, and that simple detail settled heavily, because it confirmed what everyone had already begun to understand. The gray-haired leader stepped a little closer, not aggressive, not pressing, but present. "And what happened after that?" he asked, and this time, the question did not sound like authority, it sounded like necessity. The man hesitated again, but the hesitation was different now. Not a wall, but a threshold, and he crossed it slowly. There were others, he said, and he did not need to name them for the meaning to carry, because in a town like this, everyone knew. Who gathered where? Who stood together when things turned uncertain? They said she should not be here, and the words fell flat against the silence, not because they were surprising, but because they were familiar. The girl's gaze lowered for the first time, not in shame, but in recognition, and Caleb saw it, the small shift, the memory behind her stillness. And he remained where he was, not stepping closer, not offering comfort, because this was not a moment that needed to be softened, it needed to be seen clearly. She tried to explain. The man went on, his voice quieter still, said she was looking for someone, said she had nowhere else to go, and the crowd shifted again, the kind of movement that comes when people begin to see themselves in a story they had once kept at a distance. And the necklace, the leader said, his tone steady. How did it come to be broken? And the question did not accuse. It simply connected the pieces that were already on the ground. The man closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. And this time there was no attempt to avoid what came next. She dropped it, he said, when they told her to leave. And the explanation was simple, almost too simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had followed, because it revealed not just an action, but a moment where choice had been made. Caleb's gaze moved across the faces in the crowd, not searching for guilt, not assigning blame, but acknowledging something larger, the quiet way a group can shape an outcome without any one person claiming it. And no one picked it up for her, Caleb said, his voice low, not accusing, just stating what had already become clear, and the silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. The man looked down at the silver again, turning it once more in his hand. But now the movement was different, not an attempt to understand it, but an acceptance of what it represented. No, he said softly, and that word carried not just acknowledgement, but something close to regret. The girl lifted her gaze again, her expression steady, her voice calm. I came back for it, she said, and now everyone understood that the small piece of metal had never been the point. It was what had been left behind with it, something far more difficult to reclaim. The gray-haired leader exhaled slowly, his posture shifting as the full weight of what had been revealed settled into place. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something it had not held before, not command, not certainty, but responsibility. Then we have not been looking for the right thing, he said, and the words did not resolve the moment. They opened it further, because understanding is not an end, it is a beginning. Caleb remained still beside the girl, his presence unchanged, but the space around him felt different now, not because he had done anything more, but because he had allowed something to be seen that could not be unseen. And in that quiet, under the flicker of lantern light, the town stood at the edge of something it had not expected to face, the difference between what it believed and what it had done. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt full, like the air itself had taken on weight, and no one in that street could pretend they did not feel it pressing against them, settling into their chests, their thoughts, their memory of 3 nights ago when a stranger had stood among them asking for something as simple as water. Caleb Thornfield did not move, because this was not a moment that needed motion. It needed stillness, the kind that lets truth settle where it belongs. And beside him the girl stood the same way, steady, grounded, no longer carrying the burden alone, but placing it where it could be seen by all who had helped create it. The gray-haired leader looked around slowly, his eyes passing over faces he had known for years, men he had ridden beside, spoken with, trusted without question, and now he saw something different, not strangers, but people he had never truly questioned, and that realization sat heavier than any accusation. Who else was there? He asked quietly, not directing the question to one man this time, but to the space itself, and no one answered at first, not because they did not remember, but because remembering meant stepping into something they had already begun to fear. A man near the edge of the crowd shifted his weight, then another, small movements that said more than words, and finally one voice came, hesitant, uncertain. I saw her, he said, not looking at anyone directly. She was standing near the well, and the memory began to take shape, not as a story told, But as pieces returned to where they had been left, she asked for directions. Another voice added, softer still, and the sound of it seemed to pull more from the silence, more fragments, more moments that had once seemed too small to matter, and now felt like something else entirely. Caleb's gaze moved slowly across them, not judging, not accusing, just witnessing, because this was not about finding one man to blame. It was about understanding how many had chosen not to see. The girl did not interrupt, did not guide them. She simply listened, her hand still holding the broken silver. But now it seemed less like evidence and more like a reminder, something that had been dropped and left behind, not just by her, but by all of them. We told her to leave, a third voice said, barely above a whisper, and that word, we, settled heavier than anything else spoken so far, because it did not point to one man. It pointed to many. The gray-haired leader closed his eyes for a brief moment, not long enough to escape what he was hearing, just long enough to acknowledge it. And when he opened them again, the certainty that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something steadier, something harder to carry. Then we are not dealing with a stranger's mistake, he said, his voice low. We are dealing with our own. And no one argued. Because there was nothing left to argue against, Caleb shifted his stance slightly, the faint sound of his boot against the dirt grounding the moment again. And he spoke, not loudly, not with force, but with the kind of clarity that comes when a man has nothing to prove. Truth does not arrive all at once, he said. It shows up in pieces, and what you do with each piece decides what comes next. And the words did not tell them what to do. They reminded them that they still had a choice. The man who had held the silver stepped forward again, his hand now open, the broken piece resting in his palm instead of being gripped, and he looked at the girl, not avoiding her gaze this time, not challenging it either, just meeting it. I should have picked it up, he said, and the admission was small, simple, but it carried more weight than anything he had said before, because it did not try to explain, it did not try to justify, it simply acknowledged. The girl watched him for a moment, then gave a small nod, not forgiving, not condemning, just accepting the truth for what it was, and that quiet exchange shifted something in the air again, something that felt less like tension and more like understanding. The gray-haired leader stepped forward into the center of the light, his posture straight, his voice steady. Then we will not leave this as it is, he said, and the words were not loud, but they carried through the street with a weight that came from what had already been revealed. We will follow this to where it leads, and we will not turn away from what we find. And no one questioned him this time, because the authority in his voice no longer came from position. It came from responsibility. Caleb did not respond, did not need to, because the moment no longer belonged to him. It belonged to them, to the town, to the people who now had to decide what kind of place they truly were, not in belief, but in action. The lantern light flickered again as the wind passed through, casting shadows that moved across faces now turned inward, and in that shifting light, something had changed, not completely, not permanently, but enough for truth to take hold, enough for silence to mean something different, and enough for the first step towards something better to be taken without a single shot, without a single raised voice, just a quiet understanding that what had been ignored could no longer remain unseen. The decision did not arrive with noise. It came with movement, small at first, a shift of boots against dirt, a man stepping forward instead of back, another turning his shoulders toward the center instead of away, and Caleb Thornfield saw it before anyone spoke, because change does not announce itself, it reveals itself in what men choose to do next. The gray-haired leader stood in the middle of the lantern light, his gaze steady now, no longer searching for answers, but holding on to the ones already uncovered, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the street with a quiet firmness that did not need to be raised. We go back to the well, he said, and the words did not sound like an order, they sounded like a correction, a return to the place where something had been left undone. No one argued, not this time, because the path had already been set, not by authority, but by understanding, and one by one, the men began to move, not in a rush, not in anger, but with a purpose that had replaced the certainty they arrived with earlier that day. The girl remained where she was for a moment longer, her hand still holding the broken silver, and Caleb stood beside her, neither stepping ahead nor falling behind, because this was no longer his moment to lead, it was his moment to witness. "You do not have to walk it alone now," Caleb said quietly, not looking at her, his eyes following the men as they moved toward the far end of the street, and she nodded once, the motion small but clear. "I was not alone when I came back," she replied, and there was something in her voice now that had not been there before, not relief, not victory, something steadier, something earned. They followed at a measured pace, the distance between them and the others neither closing nor widening, just enough to remain separate, just enough to let what was happening belong to those who needed to carry it. The well stood at the edge of the town square, its wooden frame worn by years of use, the rope hanging still, the bucket resting against the side as if nothing had changed since 3 nights ago. But now, under the lantern light, it looked different, not because it had moved, but because those looking at it had. The gray-haired leader stopped a few feet away, his gaze moving over the ground, the wood, the space around it, and the others spread out slightly, not searching with urgency, but with attention, the kind that notices what had once been overlooked. The man who had held the silver stepped closer, his eyes scanning the dirt at the base of the well, and after a moment, he knelt, brushing aside a thin layer of dust with his hand, slow, careful, until something small caught the light, a glint, not unlike the one the broken piece had carried, and he paused, his fingers hovering above it before lifting it gently. He stood, turning the object in his hand, and this time, there was no hesitation in his voice when he spoke. "This is the other piece," he said, and the words did not carry surprise, only confirmation, and the 2 fragments, held apart for days, now existed in the same space again. The gray-haired leader stepped forward, taking a closer look, and though he did not reach for it, the recognition in his eyes was enough. "Then this is where it was left," he said, and the statement carried more than location, it carried responsibility. Caleb remained at the edge of the circle, his arms at his sides, his posture unchanged, but his gaze steady, watching as the truth took form not through argument, not through force, but through something far quieter, something built piece by piece until it could no longer be denied. The girl stepped forward then, closing the distance, her hand opening as she brought the broken silver forward, and for a moment, both pieces existed in separate hands. Then the man hesitated only briefly before placing his piece into hers, and she held them together, not forcing them to fit, not trying to restore what had been broken, just letting them meet. And in that simple act, something shifted again, something final. The wind moved through the square, softer now, carrying the faint sound of rope against wood, and the crowd stood in silence. Not because they had nothing left to say, but because they had begun to understand what needed no words. The gray-haired leader straightened, his gaze moving from the silver to the girl, then to the men around him. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of everything that had been revealed. "We cannot change what was done," he said, "but we can decide what happens now." And no one disagreed, because the truth had already taken its place among them. Caleb finally turned slightly, his eyes meeting the girl's for a brief moment, and there was no question in that look, no instruction, only acknowledgement, because out here, justice did not come from a man with a gun, it came from a man willing to stand still long enough for others to see what they had tried to ignore, and now, under the quiet light of a town that had begun to see itself clearly, that moment had arrived. The 2 pieces of silver rested together in her hand, not whole, not repaired, but no longer alone, and under the quiet lantern light, that was enough to change what everyone in that square understood about what had happened and what had been left behind. No one reached for the pieces, no one tried to take them back, because something about the way she held them made it clear they were no longer just objects. They were a line drawn between what had been ignored and what had now been seen. The gray-haired leader stood still for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the joined fragments, and when he finally looked up, it was not with the certainty he had carried earlier that day, but with something steadier, something harder to carry. "We will make this right," he said, and the words did not rise above the quiet of the night, but they settled into the space with a weight that did not need to be louder. A few men nodded, not quickly, not out of habit, but slowly, as if each movement required them to accept something about themselves they had not considered before. and others said nothing at all, but remained where they stood, which, for the first time that night, meant something. Caleb Thornfield did not speak, because he understood that what came next did not belong to him. It belonged to the people who had to decide whether their understanding would remain words or become something more. The girl closed her hand gently around the silver, not hiding it, but holding it in a way that suggested she no longer needed to prove anything with it. And she looked across the faces in front of her, not searching for guilt, not asking for anything, just seeing them as they were. And in that moment, many of them lowered their gaze, not out of shame alone, but out of recognition. The wind moved softly through the square, carrying the faint creak of the well's rope, the same sound it had made 3 nights ago. But now it felt different, no longer part of the background, but part of something. Remembered, she asked for water. One of the men said again, quieter this time, as if the memory had found its proper place, and the gray-haired leader nodded once, his expression firm. Then that is where we begin, he replied, and without another word, he stepped toward the well, reaching for the rope and lowering the bucket with a steady hand, the sound of it descending into darkness echoing faintly against the wood. No one stopped him, no one questioned the gesture, because it was not about the water itself. It was about something else, something simple that had been refused when it should have been given. When the bucket returned, filled and heavy, he set it on the edge, stepping back slightly, not presenting it as an offering, not turning it into a display, simply placing it there. And that quiet act carried more meaning than anything that had been said. The girl watched it for a moment, then stepped forward, her movements calm, unhurried, and she reached for the bucket, taking a small sip before setting it back in place. And she did not thank anyone, did not acknowledge the gesture with words, because this was not something that required gratitude, it required understanding. Caleb stood at the edge of the square, his figure half in shadow, half in light, and he watched as the moment settled into something complete, not perfect, not finished, but real, and that was enough. The gray-haired leader turned back toward the crowd, his posture straight, his voice quiet but clear. "We do better from here," he said, and no one argued, because there was nothing left to defend, only something to carry forward. The girl stepped back from the well, the silver still in her hand, and for the first time since she had arrived, her shoulders lowered slightly, not in relief, but in release, as if something she had been holding had finally been set down where it belonged. Caleb pushed away from the post he had been leaning against, his boots soft against the dirt as he turned toward his horse, not waiting for acknowledgement, not expecting it, because out here, the work was never about being seen. It was about making sure something true had a place to stand. As he reached the saddle, he paused for a brief moment, his gaze drifting back toward the square, toward the well, toward the people who now stood differently than they had before. And then he mounted without a word, guiding the horse slowly back toward the edge of town. Behind him, the girl remained where she was, not following, not calling out, just watching. And when he passed beyond the last lantern, disappearing into the dark stretch of road beyond, she did not move right away, because she understood something now that she had not before, that sometimes justice does not arrive with noise or force. Sometimes it arrives with a man who says very little and leaves even less behind, except a silence that feels different than the one that came before, a silence where people begin to see clearly, and once they do not forget.